discussion that discuss about what exactly is sustainable food or green food, and then we move on to a session where we have case study presentations that talks about how to move towards a sustainable food system, and also it tries to link with the land desertification neutrality. So with this, may I request Professor Shalin Singhal to come on the dais and start the panel discussion, the first session.
Thank you, Chuba. So, to start with the panel discussion, first to invite our panelist, Professor Pinaki Dasgupta from International Management Institute. Please come on the stage. Chef Manjeet Gill, President, Indian Federation of Culinary Association. Please do come. And my colleague, Dr. Shubhamendla Jamir from Teddy School of Advanced Studies. Thank you. So as the title of the panel discussion is How Green is Our Food, and interestingly Dr. Chuba has laid the context of what green would constitute of, and it's not certainly the literal meaning of green relating only to environmental issues, but the access to food itself and the wastage of food, which is another area. And so there are complex dimensions which I would expect that our panelist would address, and I would like to start with Professor Pinaki Dasgupta, who is from the International Management Institute. Welcome to this panel discussion, and he would be speaking on the food, particularly on the food value chain, and let's say relating it to the issue of land resource degradation. So, thank you.
Morning everybody. Can I request the technical team to, if you can upload the presentation?
Can we have the presentation on?
Yeah, I think they just try to.
That's good.
Yeah, so if you can just move to the next slide. Yeah, so what I've done really is just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective from two perspectives. One is from the supply side and the other is from the demand side, and then try and kind of cross match the two and look at the way forward in terms of how we look at food as a perspective. So can I move to the next slide, please? Next slide. Next one. So when you look at food, the first aspect that we're going to talk about here is to do with food loss. So if you remember when Chuba started off her presentation, she basically talked about food wastage. So I go a little back and I talk about some of the wastage that really happens at the farm level, and then move on and talk about looking at food loss at the farm level, and then talk about reducing supply chain barriers, so that the food loss happens, is reduced, and we can look at supply chain efficiencies. So the first point that we are making, this is very pure data that comes in from NSSO, which is the National Statistical Organization, which tells you the kind of loss, and this is pure percentage terms. So this is the 2018 data that we have in front of us. If you really see, the biggest loss actually emerges from the fruits and vegetables segment, which is almost close to about 16%, and that's fairly alarming. And then of course we have sectors like cereals, pulses. So what I'm saying is that one of the biggest challenges that we really need to go back and plug is at the food, at the farm level. So when you're talking about food, there are three aspects that typically associated in terms of food at the farm level. What we call, once the food or the grains or the cereals or the fruits and vegetables are produced, there is an elementary processing that happens at the farm level, which is called primary processing, which is typically a grading and sorting which is done at the farm level, and that's where there is a wastage. But the bulk of the wastage actually happens is at the secondary level, which is where the food actually, or the grains or the cereals or the vegetables actually moves from the farm to the next level, which is the market. It could be a mandi, which is what we call in India. It could be a wholesale mandi, it could be a retail outlet. Often, these are which is close to the villages. So the maximum amount of wastage actually happens at the secondary stage, and then the last is what we call as the tertiary stage, which is where once the food or the grains, etc. have reached the mandi, the wastage actually happens at the mandi, either in terms of storage or in terms of keeping the food, the products for a longer period of time because of the shelf life, etc. So these are pure losses purely in terms of numbers. So this is something which is where if you really go back and look at it in terms of a number, if we have to really go back and put a number, that's close to about 10,000 crores. So we're not talking easy money. So in terms of money, it accumulates to a fairly large amount of loss that we're talking about, and this is a loss which a large part of it actually is borne by the farmer themselves. So this is something which is really a red flag that we need to kind of build around here. So how do we go back and reduce those losses? We've been talking about that for a very, very long time. To cut it short, market access still remains a major challenge. Transport and communication is a big issue that we talk about, and the business environment. I have a small point that I want to make. I think most of these discussions have happened at several forums. Let me give you a quick example of one of my own experiences in one of the central regions of a state that we are right now in. We are right now in Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the states in India, and there's a city in Uttar Pradesh, it's called Farrukhabad, and there's a lot of garlic that comes out from there. So I remember we were visiting this market where there was a wholesale market for garlic, and the garlic the previous year was selling at close to about 10,000 rupees a ton, or quintal actually. No, it was ton actually, 10,000 rupees a ton it was selling. And the next year, the year we were visiting, the market had just slashed to about 600 and 625 rupees, So most of the farmers, because of the anticipation that the prices would go up this year, because last year it was about 10,000 rupees, so this year it will go up more, they bought in so much of garlic to the market, the prices just crashed. And what actually happened was most of these farmers, who had actually so much of garlic, they had to take it back or they had to just dump it, and there was so much of food loss. So what we are saying is that often because of the fact that farmers do not have an access. Now if the same farmer had an access to a better market or a bigger market, perhaps the loss could have been reduced if not removed. So that's something which is really a ground level experience that we're talking about. The next point that we're talking about is in terms of supply chain barriers that we typically face. Cold chain is a big problem in India, and we have seen that, you know. The same city that I talked about in the previous slide, Farrukhabad, that's my ground zero experience on potatoes that we have seen. My experience was that the potatoes was in the warehouses, in the referred warehouses, which was refrigerated, but when the prices crashed, the farmers were unable to pick it up, and what the cold chain guy, the guy who was actually handling the warehouse, he took the entire consignment and sold it to the nearest and the biggest market, you know. So often cold chains are there, it's expensive, and the farmers are not able to afford it, and in terms of marketing and in terms of pricing, there remains a challenge. What's therefore coming up is a new generation of farmers that we are really seeing, you know. I mean, they might be a small blimp on the radar, but what we are seeing is that there are increasingly a lot of people, you know, from the urban sector, you know, a lot of people who are associated with technology, who have been working in the corporate sector for a long period of time, are moving back and picking up small pieces of farm. Uttarakhand, which is one of the states in India, is a big example of that, where we have seen a lot of people are actually going back, especially people from the defense services we have seen, picking up small pieces of land and doing farming, you know, and these are products which are extremely specialized products, you know. So these generations of farmers are educated, which is one. Second, they have access to market information, so market intelligence is pretty much taken care of. And the third thing is that they have better technologies and better access in terms of marketing information so that their products sell well. So these new generation of farmers are somewhere really breaking the ice in terms of looking at supply chain and the barriers that are emerging. And there is this new set of startups which are coming up in terms of how people are actually going back and working. In terms of startups and in terms of how we have seen technology working here, there is a process side to it and there is a product side to it. In terms of processes, we have seen there are a lot of startups which are trying to actually go back and bring in efficiency in farming, you know, farm mechanization, etc. And on the product side, what we are seeing is that there are a lot of products which are coming in terms of trying to go back and bring in changes from the purely how we look at the market. You know, for example, there are some aggregators who are trying to go back and bring in the farmers together and help them gain a market access from a cooperative perspective. Small steps, but they're all helping in the long term. You know, so I would believe that if you can reduce the supply chain barrier, so from one of the problems from the supply side can pretty much be taken care of. Quickly moving on to the demand side, what we have seen is there have been some videos that have been shown. What I really want to address in this discussion today here is this is something very interesting. If you really see in terms of the population, the top 5% of the population actually consumes the maximum amount of food, and that top 5% of the population is actually very small. And the middle, which is about 40 to 50th percentile of the population that is actually consuming food, that's way less. So there is a lot of disparity in terms of how the population is consuming, and which is what leads to wastage. And if you really saw that video before we came on the dais here, that actually goes back and addresses the problem that there is so much of wastage, and that number that you see there, 2859, that really is because leads to a lot of wastage, because that percentage of population is small, but the amount of food that they have on their plate is very large, and that often leads to wastage, you know. And because of increasingly lifestyle disorders, etc., so often the challenge is that maybe that food that comes on the plate is not at all relevant to them, for them, and that gets wasted. The second point which I wanted to talk about what we are seeing here is that this is the future diet in India. You know, what I've done is, this is a very interesting paper which I found, and I thought I'll just quickly showcase it to you. If you really see, and this is a data which is a fairly futuristic data. So the top items that are going to be really consumed in the future, especially, this is a purely India-driven data. So what we are saying is dairy is going to be number 1, vegetables are going to be number 2, and fruits are going to be number 3. So, and this is a fairly long-term data that we're talking about. This is not a very 2020 or a 2025 kind of a data. So dairy, vegetables and fruits are really going to rule the roost. So sitting here, it's going to be very, very important to actually go back and see how do we address this demand side problem. So this is one side, in terms of the food that's really going to be consumed. Let's look at the other side of the aspect, which is who's going to consume this food, There has to be a certain population that's going to consume. So I want to go back and just let me, I'm having a little trouble in, do I point it that side or, yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about one particular segment of the population that's really changing how we look at India today, and that's what we call as the millennial population, And that population is about 18 to 35 years old, and that's about 450 million people right now sitting in India. Now these are people, who are these people? These are typically people who are either studying, they're either people who are working. It's a fairly young population, but what is fascinating is they're eating out more often, which is very important. And once they're eating out more often, the entire food that they're looking at changes, which means that they're looking at functional foods, which means that this is the population that is no more relying on food which is the conventional food. When we talk about food in India, there is two kinds of food, One is a fixed food and the other is a flexible food. Now fixed foods are typically foods that comes in from the McDonald's and the KFCs of the world, which gives you set foods, So you have a burger, you have a fried chicken, etc. But when it comes to food, the Indian food, it's a flexible food. So you have Indian breads in the form of roti, you have vegetables, you have dal. So it's a fairly different set of combinations, But what's happening is we are moving away from the fixed and the flexible foods to more functional foods, because of the fact that they are eating out more often and they have more or less stagnant lifestyles, They sit in offices for longer duration of times, so they're very careful about the kind of food that they're eating. They are very, very conscious about the indulgences that they are doing. They look at healthy food, which is very important. They want to experiment. That's the best part, which is why probably 10 years back we had very homogeneous kind of food, But today we have Japanese, we have Mexican, and there are a lot of options that we're looking at. But one thing that's really common to the kind of experimentation that they're doing is to do with the fact that there is a lot of healthy food which is coming on the table, So therefore, when we are looking at three things that's really going to matter here in terms of the millennial population is they'll be eating and eating more often, which means that there'll be more processed food. So how do we link health to process? Because the moment you go back and process the food, there is a health aspect that comes in, because what you're doing with the processed food is you're increasing the shelf life, and then there are health aspects that becomes a big barrier there. So heat and eat is going to be the big thing. The second thing, which is kitchen to kit, which means that more and more people would be trying to move away from kitchens, They're trying to move away from kitchens and create food which is kit based, which could be energy bars, for example. We are seeing a lot of people talking about energy bars. For example, cricket in India is big. And a lot of cricketers, the big cricketers today are turning vegan, So there is a big movement towards that. And one of the things that often food people are asking them that being in active sports, how do you go back and substitute for protein? And that's where we are seeing that people are actually moving more towards functional foods that gives them the same amount of nutrients, proteins, etc., but yet remains healthy, And the last thing that we're talking about is eating for health, So no more it's about eating tasty and delicious food, but it's also about eating for health as well, So I would like to actually go back and bring this whole perspective of demand side from the perspective of the millennial population, which is one of the biggest, and how they are combating the food issues from that perspective. So what I've done is I have if you can just move to the next slide, please. So I've just, next slide. So just to kind of conclude my discussion, next, how do we really go back and sum up this entire thing from a supply side and from a demand side? So what I'm saying is handling the vagaries of the flexible versus the fixed food that I talked about a while back. Understand the dietary trends, because every population, every lifestyle has certain dietary trends that needs to be looked at. Understand the lifestyle patterns, With the services sector boom, more and more people are living in office spaces, People are moving from core manufacturing or core agriculture into more sedentary kind of lifestyles, So we have to look at lifestyle patterns and map food according to that. The challenges on supply chain, which I talked about, bring in startups, bring in technology. So technology is going to be at the forefront of most of the discussions that we're talking about today. The new generation and entrepreneurs will drive the story. I talked about the niche farmers who are coming up, and that's something very, very interesting. There are new ways to market that we have to find out. There are whole foods which are coming up, and more people are associating with specialized people. And I think we have Chef Manjeet who's going to talk a little bit more on that, how more and more people are coming in on that. And therefore, the new consumers will buy in terms of the food. So one example with which I finished my presentation, can you just move to the next slide? So this is every Sunday. What happens is we have a Gurgaon Organic Farmers Market. This is a Facebook page where especially these new generation farmers are coming and selling their products. So these are expensive products, these are high-end products, but every single product has the origin, the entire description of the product in terms of how the produce, the source of origin, the moisture level, the detailing in terms of the fruits and vegetables that they are selling. The point is, these are early days. Farmers market is something which is new in India, but the good part is farmers are finally coming in and selling directly to the consumers. I would say that this is a small step, long way home, but this is where we see the future, where farmers are finally able to come in and sell directly to the consumers. So not only it helps them get good price, but it also helps the consumers also get good high quality product. So I think that would be all from my side. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope we made some points here.
Thank you, Pinaki. This is very interesting. You have addressed one of the component in the audience, that is the millennial saga itself. And Pinaki has very interestingly talked about various challenges and barriers that we face across the supply chain. To dig a little bit deeper into that before I go to my fellow panelists, another question that arises from what you discussed and your thoughts on whom do you consider as the most critical stakeholder within this supply chain, particularly to address these barriers, and how do we transform the role of that critical stakeholder?
The way right now, if you look at India, I think the two big aspects that we really need to talk about is infrastructure. One of the things that's really happening is that maybe sometimes there is the road to which you can access the market, but then the transport is not really taken care of. If the transport is taken care of, the roads are not there. I remember that my experiences in Azadpur Mandi, which is Azadpur market in Delhi, is one of the biggest markets. So often we find that in most cases we have seen the transporter who brings the commodity into that market. He is actually going back and aggregating all the farmers' produce together and then bringing it to the market. So I would believe, and the farmer often does not know the grand realities in the market. So he just knows that the product has actually been shipped to that particular market and it's just selling. So he's more worried about the price. Because of the lack of connect between the end user and the farmer. So what's happening is that the farmer's focus therefore is purely on yield. Now let's say, for example, potatoes. Potatoes not only consumed in India and vegetables. It could be made for chips, it could be made for fries, it could be made for mashed potatoes, anything. And therefore, the quality of the potatoes is very different from when you're looking at cooking it for vegetables. So unfortunately, the connect between the farmer and the consumer is not happening because of that logistical gap, and that really I think is an information gap that plays up in the long term.
Thank you, Pinaki. Pinaki very interestingly mentioned about your paper on future diets, that is indicating increased consumption in future relating to dairy and vegetable. And also that's where I would like to invite our next panelist, Chef Gill, who's the president of the Indian Federation of Culinary Associations and formerly corporate chef at ITC Welcome Group, and he would be talking on one of the most critical aspects of the theme of our session that actually relates to the green food choices. So, Chef, thank you.
Thank you. See, my perspective is little, there are a lot of science, there are a lot of figures, there are a lot of things are highlighted and all that. But ultimate is that the the food which is for wellness or for the health is when the food goes in the mouth. Before that, the food is, just lying there somewhere, wherever it is, and get wasted. So ultimately, and I strongly believe our own heritage very much and our own knowledge. I know that there are a lot of problems in India. People are sleeping hungry also, and there's a wastage of food also and all that. But incidentally, we have the knowledge. That may not be the practice at this moment, or we are not discovering it, or we are not using it, or we are not gaining and disseminating it down the line about that knowledge. If we see in the whole world, the human being is somewhere in a civilized world, little bit, slowly, last 5,000-6,000 years. But only in the past 200 years or 150 or 200 years, we have changed.